Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 71 of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined in conversation by Elspeth Hay, author of the recently published book Feed Us with Trees, Nuts and the Future of Food. Did you know you can eat acorns? This was the revelation that inspired Elspeth's book and also got me hooked on her incredible work. I absolutely love trees and regularly share conversations about their incredible ecological importance, but Elspeth helps take our relationship to trees, in particular nut trees, to a whole different level. A place where we don't just preserve them because it's the right thing to do for biodiversity and other species, but where we can once again benefit directly from our relationship with them, and they can literally facilitate our own survival. Our food systems are making us and our planet sick, both physically and emotionally. Our farmers are at the forefront of this rupture and sadly experience a higher rate of suicide than the general population. In this nuanced conversation, we explore how reconsidering our relationship with these keystone trees isn't just about addressing a single problem. It leads us to question and reconsider everything we have been taught about our current food system, from yields to inputs and food waste, to the wisdom from Indigenous people and the food systems they employed. We also look back at the journey and trauma that ruptured our relationship with the lands and our essential place within it. The economic rather than ecological reasons that laid the path we have been taught to follow to preserve the interests of the few. Perhaps most importantly, Elspeth also offers us a hopeful and tangible solution to the multiple crises within our world. Feed Us with Trees offers us a viable alternative way to farm that isn't just a theory, but is already being implemented successfully today by multiple people around the world. Welcome, Elspeth, and thank you so much for joining us today on the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you. I'm so excited I can barely contain myself. But we're going to be talking about your exciting new book that is just on the verge of being published in July 2025, which is Feed Us with Trees. But before we get started and delving into the amazing wisdom that you're bringing into the world and sharing with your book, I always just ask my guests to share a little of their nature story. So just any fond memories or moments of your connection with nature or how it's evolved over the years to get us started would be lovely.
Well, I think my earliest memory of being outside in the natural world is this forsythia bush that I used to play in right outside my parents' window in Maine, which is where I grew up on the coast of Maine in New England in North America. And I spent hours in there making like dandelion head soup and mixing up mud and pine needles. And I still, when I think about being a kid and being outside, the forsythia bush is always the first thing I think about. And now it's totally overgrown and doesn't look the same at all, but I still check it out every time I'm back home at my parents' and say a little hello.
Oh, I love that. And I love that you still can go and visit it as well. Like it's a little sanctuary of remembrance. I think so many people often find those sanctuaries in nature, don't they? And it quite often is actually in trees and bushes, which is, it's almost like it's sort of innately wired into our DNA, isn't it? That trees are sort of a place of safety and security for us, that we, even as children, just feel drawn to them.
Yeah, it was sort of surrounded by a wood pile, so it had this great interweaving of, you know, human tending and a little bit of wildness, which was
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, no, I love that, and it's of course the perfect intro to your book where we're going to be talking all about trees, which is a favorite subject of mine. And the I got sent your book, which hasn't quite been released yet, and the thing that obviously the first sentence or the first couple of sentences that you start with is that you can eat acorns, and I literally almost fell off my chair because I often speak on my podcast about this amazing English oak tree that I have been sort of stewarding for the last sort of 10 or 15 years, and I spend a lot of time with. And I was like, Oh my goodness, it's a source of food. Like all of these years, I mean, I had sheep for a while who would often clear up the acorns and obviously know it in, in the natural world and from a conservation point of view, they're hugely valuable. I think there's research that say that the English oak tree supports like 2,000 odd species of flora and fauna. So from a sort of conservation biological import, biodynamic point of view, they were really, really important. But then to be like, wow, they could actually be useful for people in a different way was just you had me hooked from the beginning, basically.
Yeah, I had a similar experience of knowing the importance ecologically of oaks, but having no idea that humans could have this food relationship with them. My parents are bird watchers, so they watch and study birds, and my dad used to lead bird watching trips all over the world. And when I was a kid, they were writing this book called The Bird Watcher's Guide to the Coast of Maine.
Oh,
And they dragged my sister and me all over the state, going to different habitats and looking at different birds. And we spent a lot of time as kids hearing about how all these birds were perfectly adapted to their home habitats. There were sap suckers that were sucking sap out of the trees, and everything was there that they needed to build their nest. And they had this really intimate relationship with the places that they
yeah,
lived. And I remember always feeling, I don't think so much thinking, because I don't think it was conscious, but just
yeah,
feeling this feeling of like, what's wrong with us? Like,
yeah,
why?
yeah,
Why doesn't the world have anything we need? And of course, now, decades later, I know that that's not true. But from a kid and even a young adult perspective, if you look out and you see, like, okay, what the wild world needs is these oaks, right? And these other trees that are supporting all this wildlife. And the message you get is like, we need to preserve these trees for all these other species, but they're
yeah,
not really doing anything for us.
yeah, yeah,
It's such a completely different story to think, oh, we're gonna protect and promote and tend these trees that are really good for other species and support the most life out of any tree. And they're also feeding us. We're
yeah,
part of this. We're not separate. It's meeting our needs too. So for me, learning that we can eat acorns was just this incredible light bulb moment. I'm looking at an oak tree out my window right now, and I'm surrounded by oak trees and just always saw the forest as an impediment to food production. And
yeah.
it turns out that that was just a lens and not a fact, just a story, which is so exciting.
Yeah, I think it's amazing and it's something I loved about your book was that you take people on this journey of understanding where we kind of lost our connection with the trees. And I think it it is really important, isn't it? Because we have kind of I know like from my experience, I spent quite a lot of time in Africa and we have this vision of like wilderness and it is ideally devoid of people, and a lot of like the sort of national parks, both in Africa and I think in the US, not so much here because we just haven't allocated land in that way, but a lot of the national parks are people are excluded from it unless they're just there to visit. Like you can go and visit and perhaps camp in certain restricted areas, but people don't intrinsically live in them. The idea of wilderness is that people aren't living and existing and growing food and surviving there. And that's part of this sort of I suppose narrative is probably a good word for it, isn't it? That we have been fed for generations and generations of like we've it's this disconnect that we feel, and I think a lot of people will resonate with your feelings of a child of just feeling like you know that, and that's the sort of it still pertains through conservation narratives even now of like it's sort of self-sacrificing in a way, like we have to set this land aside to protect nature, but it's sort of no residual benefit to us apart from obviously there are studies around like it's good to walk in the trees and things like that, but from an actual survival point of view it is like oh, we can do that, but there isn't any benefit to us. And I think that's what's really fascinating is to actually sit there and think, you've had a wonderful mentor, didn't you, in Reed, who gave you a lot of time. He's an Indigenous person from, I think, is he the west coast of America that
Yeah,
he's
present
from?
day California, the Klamath
Yeah.
region.
And he gave you a lot of guidance of how actually their communities had lived and managed the land, but still had these huge, vibrant wildernesses that were actually, considered very valuable by the early sort of colonists and colonizers of the Americas.
Yeah, I think it's interesting through the course of getting to know Ron Reed, who, as you said, has been an incredible friend and teacher to me, and also reading through history of my own people, I have really come to not believe in the concept of wilderness
Yeah.
anymore. I think it's a very modern, imaginary construct. I say this as someone who, I grew up in Maine. My parents had this 8 acres, and then next door to us was this 8 acre conservation property. And my sister and I would, kind of sneak over there and play, but it was very much a place where, it was the mantra, what is it? Like, take take only photographs, leave only
Yeah,
footprints.
yeah,
And people were welcome, but only to recreate. And that's also um, not in the same way, but I live in a national park now on Cape Cod, in the Cape Cod National Seashore, and millions of people come to visit every year. When I started researching some of the history after getting to know Ron Reed and learning more about the history between my own ancestors, not necessarily my personal ancestors, because it's very hard to trace, but my people and Reed's people and other Indigenous people all over the US, the history that I learned as a kid is completely not factual. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the legislation, when national parks were created, there's almost always a bill right before the bill to create the national park to remove the Indigenous people.
yeah,
So these landscapes that we call wild and natural and pristine have actually been created by humans, intended by humans for thousands of years. And it's the idea that that's not true, and that these are, if you there's some really conflicting stories even today that, like, I don't think I saw as conflicting before. Like, if you go on the website for the Cape Cod National Seashore where I live, there's a page all about prescribed fire and the importance of fire in tending the ecosystem here, which includes oak trees, and was a really big piece of what I ended up learning about oaks, that oaks and fire have this really long relationship, and not just fire, but human fire, like
yeah,
intentionally set cultural fires. So there's a whole page about how long fire has been part of this landscape and that it's involved humans, the indigenous Wampanoag people who've lived here for thousands of years. And then there's other descriptions of the park that call it a natural, wild, pristine
yeah.
landscape. And until very recently, until getting to know these oak trees and other nut species better, and really getting to know Ron Reed and learning more about his culture, and then sort of reaching out from there and learning about other cultures all over the Northern Hemisphere, those things, those contradictions didn't stand out to me. They didn't pop out as like, well, that's a really weird thing to say. And I think that that's how deep this story goes, and this idea of erasure. Our stories work really hard to erase the presence of Indigenous people,
Yeah.
because telling a more factual story is really painful and
Very confronting.
challenging. Yeah,
Yeah,
and confronting. And um, but I think also really necessary right now. If we're, for anyone doing ecological work or trying to create a different ecological future, I don't think that we can do that without confronting some of these stories. So the story that I focus on the book I call No Farms, No Food. And I named it that because that was a bumper sticker. I don't know if you have it in the UK, but in the US it's quite common.
Yeah,
Um,
I think we have perhaps a variation of it, but very much still the same sentiment. Yeah.
yeah, and it's really a very well-meaning sticker. It's almost always on the bumper of farm trucks of like small local agriculturalists who are doing great things. Um, but it's also a story that we have in our culture that without farms, there is no human food, and that, hunting and gathering is sort of this relic from the past and something that's not really possible today because that way of producing food or getting food isn't as productive and is completely different from farming. And I really, as I came to research the book, I really came to see that as a story that people of my ancestry have created and worked really hard to spread hand in hand with
And
colonialism.
done
And
really well spreading it as well. They've been incredibly successful,
unfortunately,
unfortunately. Yeah.
yeah. And also a story that's it's just not true and is really harming all of us, I think. And is a story that I hope we're ready to let go of. It's
Yeah.
not true.
It is a story that is propagated hugely, and in respect to many aspects of attempts to sort of change our narrative and course. I mean, even in this country, even in the conversation between things like organic farming and regenerative farming versus more sort of farming that uses like artificial inputs and artificial fertilizers, that same narrative comes in of like the yields and the questions that like, oh, we can't feed the like 8 billion people in the world now, like with, these old systems. And it was really it was really interesting to see you in a couple of chapters, I think, like work through that you were sort of thinking and questioning and who you spoke to. And one of the things that really stood out for me is like they often one of the sort of defenses that props up this propaganda narrative is the idea of yields, and basically like we need these massive yields. I mean, I know in the UK and Europe, when I think it was while I was still at school, it probably would have been my last years of school time. Um, we had this whole thing with like these food mountains, basically, where we were overproducing and had this huge amount of like waste of, crops and dairy and all sorts of things that we were just producing in such massive quantities because of certain subsidies that were in place, that basically it was just going to waste. And there is still a huge issue with waste, and it like we're overproducing what we need. And but actually when you were discussing it, you went really quite nuanced in like the fact that it's very much like they look at a monoculture, and actually the type of system that you're talking about where trees are part of it. I think you went to a lovely chestnut farm and they talked of how they grow different crops alongside it, and actually then it was like, well, I get 100% yield from my chestnut trees, and then they had another crop that they were growing, and then actually the ground underneath it they were grazing animals over, and suddenly you're not talking about a monoculture, and it becomes a very complicated equation to actually compare these. And I think that's the thing, isn't it, is it's been to sort of have this propaganda story, the equation's been really oversimplified by this idea of like this monoculture. And we've kind of lost this whole nuance of actually like the way that you're talking of using nut trees is in a whole like ecosystem manner. And then there's lots of other things as well that you have to factor in into that equation.
Yeah, I got pretty obsessed with the yield question for a while. I spent several, I mean, months, if not years, because I am so indoctrinated with our
Yeah.
our cultural stories and this idea that hunting and gathering is not as productive as farming, and we can't feed people with these quote unquote wild foods. And I had been out to California to visit Ron Reed in the Klamath River Basin and learned from him about traditional Kuruk food production, uh, and was really fascinated by that, and the way that oak grassland type ecosystems have been tended there for thousands of years in connection with this river system to produce a huge abundance of food. Um, but I also had questions and doubts about whether this really could feed, our constantly expanding population today of 7.9, or I don't know, maybe we're up to 8.1 billion at this point. And so I knew that that would be the biggest argument,
Yeah.
and I really wanted to know the answer. So I ended up going deep, deep down that rabbit hole, and I found that this idea that something like an oak tree can't yield as much food as a field of corn, for instance, is fictional on many levels. The first sort of fiction to confront is the idea that we even need all the food that we're producing in the first place. So one of the most surprising things that I found when I was doing the yield research was that 90, well, okay. So if you break it down, over 99% of the corn that we grow, that we say that we're growing to feed the world in the US, is doing something besides feeding human bodies in the United States.
It's
So,
just
like,
mind blowing,
I
isn't
mean, it's mind-boggling.
it? Yeah.
45% of it is being used to produce ethanol. I think another, I don't know if I'm going to get the splits exactly right, but maybe another 30% is being used, 30 or
I think you said 40% in your
40. Yeah.
book. Yeah.
Okay, another
For animal feed,
40%
wasn't it?
is for
Yeah.
animal feed. And these are animals that would be doing better on these oak savanna, oak grassland type ecosystems that Indigenous people had created prior to European uh, arrival. So and then the remaining 15%, there's some that gets exported and hurts local agricultural economies in other countries because it's been deeply subsidized. So the idea that we have to do this really environmentally devastating farming to produce food for people here to eat, that is not true. So first of all, we only need to produce about 1% of that food to
Yeah.
eat.
Yeah.
So that's where we're starting. And then the other thing is that there's actually been some really interesting studies, looking at comparing, the exact ecosystems that I was looking at. So an oak savanna versus a cornfield. And as soon as I started reading through these studies, a few things popped out. And one is, if you think about the photosynthetic capacity of an oak tree or an oak savanna versus a little corn plant or even a patch of
Yeah.
corn plants, and corn is actually, that is not to knock corn. Corn is an incredible plant and does this C4 photosynthesis and is is a powerful plant in its own right. But the idea that this tree that can be hundreds of feet tall doesn't have a larger capacity to create food from the sun, when you stop to think about it, like, of course that tree can make more food, that it can capture more sunlight, and that is how we create sugars and starches. That's how we make food. We being plants, our plant relatives.
Yeah.
Um, so there's that. But then there's also the fact that if we look at some of these high yielding agricultural fields, what we're measuring when we're talking about food to feed the world, to feed everyone, is how much we can produce from the land that we have, right? How much food can
Yeah.
we produce from the land that we have? And cornfields, modern industrial cornfields, do deliver some amazing yields when you just look at the acre where they're being produced.
Where they're
But
being
what
harvested off of,
Yes,
basically.
where we're
Yeah.
being harvested off of. But if you actually look at the land that it took to create that really concentrated harvest, you're bringing in fertilizer, you're bringing in machinery. And what we don't often talk about is, like, a tractor is not land neutral, right? That metal had to, they had to be mined from somewhere. Other landscapes had to be denuded to create that. The same for the fossil fuel production to run those. And if you actually look at it from a land perspective, yield is a ratio. This is something that Ricardo Salvador, who's an amazing agronomist, told me, and it measures what you're getting out for what you're putting in. And
Yeah.
when you actually measure that honestly, those yield gains disappear and in fact are reversed. So it's actually much more land intensive to create these quote unquote high yield food systems than
Yeah.
it is to work in relationship with a local food producing ecosystem. And, not everywhere has oak trees or chestnuts or hazels as a keystone species, but everywhere has keystone trees and keystone species that humans have learned over thousands of years to be in relationship with. So, I've spoken with some people from Australia, and that's always interesting because it's such a different, I don't know a lot about the Australian landscape,
Yeah.
but I do what we've talked about is just whatever the keystone species are, so those are the species that support the most life in your region. Those are the species that we traditionally have been in relationship with and that we need to learn how to get back in relationship with because those are the species that produce the most for us and for everyone else. And true productivity is for everyone, for all species. It's not isolated to one species. And so I think we've become really confused about yield, and that's been the result of several hundred years of intentional confusion.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, it's something I had a guest a while ago, and he had a lovely term for it called orthodoxies, and basically this idea of like questioning things that have always been done as like, just don't take it for granted that they should always continue to be done, and I think that's the important thing is, and I think it's one of the big things I take away from your book as well is actually to start really opening our eyes and our mind to what we've been told is kind of the truth and to actually sort of question it a bit deeper. And I mean, you haven't, you're not a scientist in your own right. You've gone out and spoken to amazing people who are out there doing this work, and this knowledge and information is there, and it's freely available. And thank goodness for most of us, you've done you've done several years of hard work bringing it all together. So we just have to read your book, but or at least get started by reading your book rather than having to dig around quite so much. But it is just, I think it's actually going back to having that sort of almost curious childlike approach of like questioning and, well, why is that? And why is that? And is that true? And it it requires quite a bit of courage to do that because when you believe something for your entire life and then you're like, hang on a minute. And I think the yield question, I mean, that was part of why I brought it up because I think it is a very strong argument that is waged against a lot of these attempts to offer an alternative way of producing food. And and I love that you cover the fact that actually it should be an equation that includes input versus output, and it's been warped, and we're only given like part of the equation for the monoculture crops, whereas they then hold up these, your lovely sort of, I guess, food forests is one term for it, but there's quite a few different sort of genres that fit in that, where you're basically growing multiple crops in this sort of more ecosystem manner where they support each other. And a lot of them become almost closed system where the inputs become very, very minimal, if any, are needed. And then that's when you do begin to shift like this equation quite considerably. And it has huge benefits for us, but has huge benefits for nature as well.
Yeah, I think what's happened in the conversation is that we tend to confuse economics with ecology,
Yeah.
or not necessarily confuse them, but sometimes we're like a yield question is fundamentally an ecological question, right? It's how much can this land produce for us to eat and what kind of yields can it sustain? And whether or not that's makes sense in our current economic system is an economic question and, important in its own right because we all have to survive under this economic system, which exists. But economics is something that we've made up. It's not a field with natural laws like ecology. And so it's sort of a red herring when people say people talk about the yield measures as if they're talking about ecology, when really often what they're talking about is economics and whether
Yeah.
or not it makes
Yeah.
sense under our economic system. And a lot of these things, these food production systems that make much more sense ecologically, don't make sense under our economic system. And that's because we have designed an economic system that does not work with ecology. But the good thing about the fact that we've designed it is we made it up. It's not bound to natural law. We can change it. I'm not saying that's easy, but um it's
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 possible.
possible and it's necessary,
Yeah.
if we're being honest with ourselves, because we really, I think it's gone beyond we need a new relationship with the natural world. I think that a lot of us, even more than just needing it, we want it. It doesn't
Yeah.
feel good to operate in a way that's pushing us closer and closer to collapse. And it doesn't feel good physically. So many of us are sick from our food system. It doesn't feel good emotionally. Farmers in the US have one of the highest, like, I think it's 3.5 times higher suicide rate
That's
than
the
the
same
general
over here.
population.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel good in terms of our relationships. There's so many levels on which this system is failing us. And on the one hand, that's really depressing and overwhelming. And on the other hand, I think that what excited me in terms of learning about these trees and our really ancient relationship with them is there's actually, like, I mean, if we can transition our food system to tending keystone nut trees in the northern hemisphere, oaks and acorns, chestnuts, hazelnuts. It's one of these, like, oh my gosh, look at all these problems it solves. Like, you're taking a food system that currently is, wreaking havoc on the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, all these vital life cycles, and you're putting carbon in the ground instead of taking it out. Now, in addition to food, a lot of traditional oak areas in Europe were managed with coppice, so you can also produce firewood in addition to nuts. You're you're increasing biodiversity because there's so many species that rely on these trees. There's all these problems, right? And if we look at them as individual problems, they're really overwhelming and hard to solve. But if we start to realize, oh, wait, they have a common theme and they also have common solutions, we might not need to solve each one individually. And for me, that's what this sort of acorn light bulb was, whoa, this is not like a one problem solution. This is a journey from sort of a sick, disconnected lifestyle to a whole system lifestyle where you're checking off a lot of boxes in terms of change and positive change.
And I think the other side of it is without like the sacrifice as well. Like it's the equation is just loaded with more and more benefits. And I mean, one of the things that you also talk about in the book is the sort of health and nutritional benefits of diet. I mean, it's something that I'm quite passionate about in my podcast is bringing in like that sort of health element to the understanding of the interconnectedness of it all. And I mean, you talk specifically about sort of heart disease and metabolic disease and things, and actually how having these trees as like the keystone and then other crops in and around them, like you get healthier food and then you have healthier, happier people. And and you solve other problems because then you don't have like this burden on society of all of these, sort of metabolic illnesses and things. And it's one of those things that when you sort of delve into it, you're like, it makes so much sense. Why aren't we doing it? But it's a big change, and people are intrinsically adverse to change, and we're quite wedded to our narratives, like you've mentioned, like no farm, no food, and we've been shaped by. There's been a lot of money spent on propaganda by people with vested economic interests in it, and but there is a momentum gaining, isn't there, of people who, like you said, there are people who are feeling that this is not just something that's nice to have, it's something that we need to have, and they want to have it, and they feel it. Like you were that person. You felt like there's something missing from my life and my perception of the world, and you've gone out and you've kind of found a lot of those missing links.
Yeah, I think, change can be really slow and then it can happen really fast. And
Yeah.
I've seen that in my own life. I think that part of my ability to receive what I was learning about the acorns, I had just come out of a, a challenging mental, emotional situation, and I was having all this back pain. And my mom had always had back pain, and this was just before I saw this TED Talk about acorn eating, and I was going to get back surgery. They had told me I had a herniated disc, and I believed that. And I just sort of thought, well, I have a bad back. My mom had a bad back. And I went to this physical therapy place because they said I had to go do that before the back surgery. And the physical therapist told me a new story. He said, there's nothing wrong with your back. You're in pain because you've been stressed out and you've been avoiding doing certain things because you're afraid of hurting your back. And I think he said too much forward motion. That was like his diagnosis of my life, which felt right at the time. And he said there's nothing wrong. And I I don't know why, but I believed him and I started doing what he said. And within 3 weeks, about 10 years of back pain was completely resolved. And it created this opening, I think, for me mentally of like, all right, what else have I been believing
Yeah.
that is completely untrue? And I was lucky to receive, they always say like when the student is ready, the
Yeah.
teacher will appear. And it was around the same time that I started learning like we can eat acorns. And I think I noticed that once I saw how quickly that one thing could change, it was like, all right, like I'm here, I'm available for change, like throw it at me. I'm ready. And
Yeah.
I do think that's a tipping point that we're reaching as a culture. I think there are a lot of people who, sometimes you have to be at a bit of a breaking point physically, emotionally, whatever it is, to be ready to look around and say, wow, this isn't working. This is not working at all. And I think a lot of us are there. I think so much of what we're doing isn't working. And so people are ready for change. And I think, um, you bring up the health stuff. It was so interesting when I first started thinking about, okay, well, what would happen if like we replaced some of these other staple foods, which when I looked into that, I mean, there are some abysmal statistics about the United States. I think one of the things I found, I can't remember the year, but pretty recently, that the top source of calories for most Americans was grain-based dessert. I mean, that cannot be good.
Yeah.
Um, it does not seem like a good sign. But I started thinking, okay, well, what would actually happen? Like say we just swap out what we're eating now for these nuts tomorrow. Um, and uh at first I was thinking, okay, these specific foods, and the more I looked at it and the more examples I started finding of cultures and people in different places who were in good health, or maybe had been in good health and had been forced to make a switch to our, they call it SAD, standard American diet, which seems very fitting, um, and saw
That,
these health declines. And the the common feature was not necessarily, oh, they were always eating this food. It was always they are in a healthy relationship with the place where they live, and they are working with the ecosystems around them to produce abundant food. And I started thinking, I grew up with the pyramid, right? So there's like the grains on the bottom, and then you go up and vegetables and fruits and meats, and the pyramid has a lot of problems, but it's also like this symbol of hierarchy
Yeah.
and control, and so emblematic of the way our food system works and the way our culture is and the way we think about food. And by the end of my research, I really felt like the way to think about a healthy diet is to think about a healthy place. Like the place, it's just sort of a trust in the world and our ecosystems. Like we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to figure this out from scratch. A healthy place will produce in abundance the foods that healthy people need. And yes, we can tweak this, and there's nuance and we can adjust it. Um, but that is, and there's lots of tools we can use to do that. We can use fire, we can use coppice, we can use the way we're managing oceans and river systems. But the theme is that we're in relationship, we're paying attention, and the healthy diet component follows that in a lot of ways. And especially if we're looking to Indigenous wisdom of the past, there are examples of times when it doesn't just follow, with no knowledge. There's knowledge that needs to be had. For instance, when European colonizers started growing corn, but didn't understand nixtamalization, which is a longstanding way of, in indigenous cultures, making the B vitamins in corn available. And
Yeah.
so a lot of people got really sick. So that's the caveat, which is yes, these ecosystems provide, and in relationship with them, they've got what we need in terms of general building blocks, but we do need to understand the nuances and how to work with them. And I think um, that is a very important thing to remember, not to just go in thinking, all right, we got it. We can figure this out, but that you can't really be in a relationship with a place that's healthy without understanding its history and the social history of how the community got to be the way that it is today.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and something that I loved in your book. Obviously, you're based in the US, and I'm based in the UK. But actually, a big section of your book came back to the UK, and you talked specifically about the New Forest and the commons there, and how this way of working to farm, I suppose, for want of a better word, because it is farming. This is something that you compared earlier on. Is like, we've chosen specific language to basically be disparaging of certain things that we wanted to eradicate from culture for the benefit of some and the sort of control of others. Really, I suppose, for to simplify it as much as possible, but it's that there is a long history of this kind of connectedness with nature and seeing nature, that we're a part of it. We're a keystone species. We have managed land and resources, and it's not sort of, you talk about the use of the language of like hunter gatherers and farming and the origins of that. And I mean, I think the farm and the farmer was about collecting taxes. Is that the origin of it? And the hunter-gatherer terminology is something that's much more recent and was used to sort of portray people as lazy and without thinking of the consequences, and they sort of would wake up in the morning and hope that they stumbled across a berry while wandering aimlessly through the world with no awareness or perception. And it's these subtleties that I think, like, more and more we have to draw our attention to and just sort of question and be aware of, and realize that there is a much deeper story and a deeper narrative, and there's a deeper history. And while it feels, I think we mentioned earlier that sometimes it feels like we're starting from scratch, but actually there is some history to get us started and get us going. And we can and there are cultures around the world that have actually managed to keep that thread going through to modern times.
Yeah, I think there's this really strong story in, at least in dominant Euro-American culture, that the hunter-gatherer is a person of the past and a passive
Yeah.
person, and the farmer is a person of the present and a modern person. And I started wondering after I went out to Mammoth and as I got to know Ron Reed and learn more about Karuk, acorn, and oak tending systems. Um, you know, Ron had told me, well, fire, there's this sort of amazing tool that's doing all these things. Fire is trying to control the water cycle in the region so that you don't get this ping-ponging between forests that get overgrown and then become prone to wildfire and then burn back to nothing. Instead, you're using fire to keep the land in an intermediate stage of ecological succession, sort of holding it steady, controlling the water resources to keep things healthy. And so I'm thinking, okay, controlling water, that sounds a lot like farming, watering your crop. And then he told me that fire was used to control acorn weevils, which are a pest of acorns. You'll open it up and there's a little almost like maggot-like bug in there, which, most people are not psyched to find in their dinner, although they are edible and totally harmless. Someone said, oh, protein. But maybe not what you're looking for. And the smoke from fires actually controls weevil populations and also controls some other pathogens. So again, I don't know about listeners, but to me, that sounds like a job that's part of farming. There's fire also recycles nutrients back into the soil. So as trees and other species in the ecosystem drop their foliage and uh, leave it on the ground, if it's left there to rot, the nutrients will return to the cycle, but it takes a lot longer than if it's burned. So it's almost like this fertility boost. Again, that's a job that's involved in farming, fertilizer. And as the more we talked and as we went through these uh, descriptions, I really started to wonder what is the difference between these food production systems that we've labeled as hunting and gathering and farming and how recent is this term? Because I had learned in school that, we all used to be hunter-gatherers. I'm sure everyone
Yeah.
in Euro-American culture has heard this story. We were all hunter-gatherers, but then the population grew and it wasn't productive enough. So about 10 or 12,000 years ago, depending on who you ask, we transitioned to being farmers, and that's how modern humans were created. And that is just, uh, I don't think, I have a friend who said, like, I think someone saying that in 10 years is going to be like embarrassed. Like, that is just not, it's not factual. There are certain species of grains that, yes, we got into relationship with at a certain point in certain areas. And that happened, not just in Europe, but also in North America. I mean, it's ironic to paint a whole continent of people as hunter-gatherers who taught English settlers to farm corn.
Yeah.
Uh, but additionally, you know, the relationship that humans have developed with grain is one where, we're preparing the earth for this crop and then we're tending it. And really, the relationships that we have with some of these other species, like oaks, is is not different. It's a different stage of succession, so it looks different, right? You're trying to keep the land in a middle stage of succession instead of taking it back to bare earth. But people are doing all the same jobs and they're thinking about the future and they're planning for food production. And that makes so much more sense. That's what we as humans do. We're trying to take care of our communities and we're doing that thoughtfully and carefully. And to sort of pretend otherwise, like there's groups of people who are just waking up in the morning and saying, like, oh, I wonder where we're gonna go today to look
Yeah.
for berries. Like, that is a ridiculous and really insulting idea.
Yeah.
Like, that's not true at all and has been used to caricature Indigenous communities and is a really I think, painful and just mean-spirited form of erasure and part of the ongoing erasure and genocide of Indigenous people in the United States. Um,
It was a
but
tool of oppression, really, wasn't it? Yeah.
yeah, and really goes back to what I was surprised to learn when I started learning about, these ecosystems and the ways that I could find history about, how my own people, like English ancestors, used to be in relationship with these trees. But when I started trying to find the rupture, it was confusing. It seemed like if you went back a few hundred years, there were a lot of communities living in relationship with these woodlands. There was forest law, there were all these laws and regulations and customs around how we interacted with the forest, and places like the New Forest, which I visited, where people have been tending livestock in these common areas in relationship with these trees for who knows how long,
Yeah.
thousands of years. Um, but when I started to go back, I really noticed that the birth of our modern economic system and the disconnect from these trees really has gone hand in hand. It's very hard to privatize land that people really value and want to hold on to. And so this no farms, no food story was written in concert with the separation of land from people and people from land. And that's a separation that started with this sort of internal colonization of England and then Europe, and really has just been spread by European, I call them settler soldiers in the book, because settler is sort of this friendly, benign word, and very often that was not the process that took place. Um,
Yeah,
but
unfortunately they brought their trauma with them, didn't they? And
yeah, it's been
yeah,
a cycle of perpetuated trauma, and I think it's created a system that really isn't good for any of us. I don't think this system is benefiting anyone. And I say that knowing full well that yes, some people are materially benefiting from the system in ways that others are not, and there is a hierarchy within that. And also, I think in the ways uh that make human life joyful and beautiful, that sort of material wealth has come with this spiritual and cultural impoverishment.
yeah.
And the system it's hurting different people in different ways and to different degrees, but it's fundamentally just not a system that is good for human beings. And I think
Or the
it's one
planet
that we're
even.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and that's another thing, the fact that we even have to clarify like that, like could there be a system that
Yeah.
was bad for the planet, but good for human
Yeah.
beings? Like
Yeah.
we live here.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's I don't think that can exist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? We've just become so used to this idea of separation, and we've thought it's okay to, like, kind of create these hierarchies, ride roughshod over, you know, I mean, obviously the environment, but also other people. When you delve deeper into this, you realize how much social justice roots and all of that is just inextricably linked with this path we've been walking on for, a very, very long time. But there is another way, and I think, I mean, there's a couple of things I thought of when you were talking, and one was when you were talking about fire, and I was actually thinking about my childhood when I was growing up in the UK. Fire was part of, like, conventional agriculture. Like, at the end of harvest, all of our what we call stubble fields, so it'd be where we were growing like wheat and oats and barley crops, they would be burnt, like the stubble, so that, they would have harvested the grain off, they would have taken the straw crop off, and then the fields would be burnt. Like, so fire was an intrinsic part of the agricultural system that I grew up with. So we're talking of, I mean, it is illegal now. You're not allowed to do it. There, it was outlawed here. So because of, I think, links to, like, concerns about the environment and the impact of the fire and the smoke. But it was it's the same thing. Like they valued the fire and its ability to return nutrients to the soil quickly and to make that available for future crops. So it's not as separated as it perhaps feels. It's also intrinsically linked. And I think that's the thing. I mean, I just love your book and I hope everyone will go and read it because I think it's so fascinating on so many different levels. It brings together multiple ideas of actually how these trees serve different purposes that you've got the food crops. People will probably be more familiar with things like hazelnuts. They might be a bit more accepting and think, oh yes, I could, we and almonds even, like almond flour and things that's have had a certain renaissance in recent years and decades within our culture already. And so it's not a massive step to go, okay, well actually there's other trees that fulfill that role as well. Um, I know one of the things is like food security, and you mentioned towards the end how acorns can actually be stored once dried for years. So there is again, like, there was food security. It wasn't this, we're going to wake up this morning and hopefully we're going to be able to feed ourselves. It was like, we could prepare for the winter, we could feed ourselves through times of different outcomes. And it's just important, I think, that people start having this conversation. But then at the end of your book, I know we're getting towards the hour, and I just want to bring this in. You specifically talk about how it's more powerful to be for something than to be against something. And I think a lot of people probably sit in a space where they feel like the system is broken, it's not working, but without a viable alternative of what to move towards, you kind of end up in this sort of limbo space of like, what do I put my energy behind? And I think that's what's so lovely about your book is like you're like, there are people who've been doing this for decades. I mean, that literally some of the people that you had the ability to speak to are still alive. They're people who have sadly passed, who have done a huge amount of sort of the groundwork on this as well for us. And there is a viable story for us to move towards, and I think that's what I would like to sort of leave people with is this kind of feeling of hope that there are answers, that it is possible. There are people already doing that.
Yeah, I definitely feel that way after I've been reporting on food and the environment for over 15 years. And I think for a while I was stuck in that space of like, oh, okay, this helps a little. This is kind of okay, I guess. And the conversations I've had with nut growers and indigenous knowledge keepers and scientists and just a huge array of different people working with these nut trees over the past 5 years are just so exciting and hopeful and make me want to run toward the future.
Yeah.
I've gotten certified in prescribed fire so that I can be a part of tending some of these oak savanna type ecosystems in my own home on Cape Cod. And I got into willow basket weaving through this randomly through this. It started out with hazelnut and then I couldn't access that. So I'm reading a book right now about coppice agroforestry. And it's just like once these pieces of the puzzle for this alternative future start coming together, it's like, oh man, I want to get there fast and not, I try to keep this idea of urgency without hurry. You don't want
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
rush toward this thing blindly, but also like when something is that exciting and beautiful, like there is an urgency. It's like, okay, I can't wait to wake up every day and work more on on this. I want to every day I get more in relationship with these trees. I get more in relationship with other people who are tending these ecosystems and who are knowledgeable about it. And, I'm learning all these new skills and ways of being in relationship. And I think that, we do live in a really challenging time, but also a really exciting time when there's a lot to learn. And maybe that's just, I'm one of those people who's always like, oh, whoa, you can do that. And that's exciting. And I think that all of us have a little bit of that in us. And so whatever draws you in, maybe it's not processing acorns, maybe it's you're into mushrooms or
Yeah.
weaving or tool making or whatever it is. There's so much to do, and as long as it involves being in relationship with these ecosystems that are really calling out to us and asking for our presence, uh, I think that what we build will be really beautiful.
Oh, I love that, Elspeth. It's so beautiful. I love how, I mean, I could honestly speak to you for hours and hours, and I know we were honestly, for anyone listening, we have literally only just like scratched the surface of the amazing amount of wisdom that Elspeth has got in her book, Feed Us with Trees. I mean, there are so many more things that I could talk to you about that you cover in your book. You talk about biochar. There's just numerous things about how people have been in community with trees for thousands of years, and also, one of the things you also mention is how the trees respond to people as well, how they thrive when they are in this community with people. You mentioned very briefly about coppicing and pollarding, and how that's an ancient relationship with the trees that actually increases their yields coming back to that word, and the harvests that are possible by nurturing them and being in relationship with them and just viewing them in a completely different way. And I think it is exciting, and I hope everyone's going to go and read your book, because I've already read it and I want to read it again already. I've literally barely put it down, and I'm like, oh, I need to go back and read that again. And I highlighted so many things, and it is exciting. And I think there are times when it can feel overwhelming. And you also had a lovely bit at the end of your book, and I think it was something that your sister has on her fridge. Is that
Yes,
right?
it's still on there.
Yeah. And I just loved it because it just jumped out to me, and I've written it down, and it says it can be overwhelming to witness, experience, and take in all of the injustice of the moment. But the good news is they're all connected. So if your little corner involves pulling away at one of the threads, you're helping to unravel the whole damn cloth. And I think that's just really important. It's like whatever, you can do. Like sometimes it doesn't feel like enough, but actually it does make a difference. Like, you just nibbling away at your little corner of thread actually can help the whole. And just knowing that there's people out there like you who are doing your bits. I know you're setting up some great things in your local community. You've got I think a farmers market, and you're setting up various other things as well. And hopefully there'll be another book as well in the future. But it is just holding on to that I think we are more powerful than we have been led to believe, and that's another propaganda story for another day, isn't it? But just to remember that actually there is this beautiful world out there that wants to be working in concert with us. And just to, like for you, it was your experience with your back, and it sort of opened the crack, and then you listened to the TED talk about how you could eat acorns, and I think it didn't just open the door, it like blew the door off its hinges. Like this whole world flooded in, and that there is that out there for all of us, and it is an exciting time. And yeah, I just thank you today for your time. I thank you for the book as well, putting like 5 years into that project and bringing it together for all of us. And I know that the ripples it's going to create in the world are going to be huge. So thank you so much, Elspeth.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fiona. Those are very kind words.
Thank you so much for listening to the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I truly hope this conversation has brought some hope and inspiration into your life. I would love to have these messages ripple out across the world. So if you can, please share this episode with your friends, leave a review on your favourite podcast player, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. I would love to hear from you, so please feel free to connect with me on the links provided in the podcast description. But most importantly, thank you so much for being a part of this journey with me. But don't forget to simply get out there and enjoy the natural world.